This is Harry Murray at Murray's Fly Shop in Edinburgh, Virginia. Today we're going to talk about fishing some of the minnows and the crayfish in a typical smallmouth stream such as the North and South Fork of the Shenandoah River. In my hand you'll see I'm holding the typical minnow that you would find in any smallmouth river. This particular one we refer to as a shiner. The streamer on the right is the silver outcast streamer that Charlie Waterman came up with that matches this. There are lots of minnows all over these drainages, and they represent a very important part of the food. And the techniques that I'm going to show you are really the backbone of all smallmouth fly fishing. In this picture, you're seeing Jeff Murray teaching a member of one of our classes the art of fishing streamers. Now, streamers, again, remember, we're talking about min imitation. Jeff's had the angler cast to spot number 1. At that location, the streamer will sink slowly, and he will impart a stripping action with his line hand. You see his line hand is right on the grip. He's using the left hand here to impart that pulling action. Now, as he's doing that, the current itself flowing away from you is forcing that fly downstream toward number 2. That's where the strike would come, right along in that area, because he probably has his maximum depth there. He's showing the fly to the fish broadside. There, if he hasn't gotten a strike here, he'll pick that cast up and cast out to number 3. Then he's going to do the same thing. He's going to strip that with his line hand. The current is going to push that down to number 4. So what you're doing, you're covering a bigger piece of the pie. Although this is just one photo in this whole series that we're going to show you today, that is the backbone of all streamer fishing for smallmouth bass. Actually, it's the same thing Jeff and I do on the Yellowstone and the Madison River out west. This is what I consider the standard streamer technique, where you're showing that fly to the fish. The action is the same and the tactics are the same, and it is so effective because when it's done properly, you're going to feel that strike. You're going to hook a very high percentage of these fish. Really hardly any excuse for missing a strike out here. The only way you miss a strike is because when you feel it, your brain doesn't kick in to say, set that hook. I set the hook with both my line hand and the rod. But however you're doing it, the secret is to do a prompt hook setting procedure, because this is the backbone of all streamer fishing. We're going to talk about the crayfish. Very high protein food for the smallmouth bass. When I was a kid, we used to seine them and fish them as live bait, and goodness, they're effective. It wasn't until I was well out of college that I really got into fishing the artificial crayfish. Ben Sly was a very good friend of mine, and he talked me into the importance of that. You'll see the 2 flies on the right. Both of these are Murray crayfish, the top one being an olive color. Then we get into the brown color below. But these represent the crayfish. We can pump these along so they'll swim and actually act like that crayfish. I was bass fishing last night, and it was an area just like that. Crayfish live along those banks under the cobblestones, softball size cobblestones on the stream bottom. For the area, I'll say from that bank out maybe 15, 20 feet. There are lots and lots of cobblestones under there, and the crayfish scoot around underneath there. My first cast there would be to the number 1 spot. I'll let it sink. Now, we're talking about water here now of 2 feet deep, maybe 3 feet at the most, but that's water back here at number 1 is 2 to 3 feet deep. So I'm going to cast in close to that shore, let that crayfish sink deeply. Now the current is pushing to our right here, so I'm going to strip that out, not in a swimming motion, but a little darting motion, because that's the way those little characters jump around in through. They'll dash from one rock to the other rock to the other rock. So I'm going to impart a line hand strip, what you see there, but not a long pull. I'm going to only have that little guy jumping along about 2 or 3 inches at a time and then stop 2 or 3 inches at a time. Now the current is going to be pushing downstream as you see me headed toward number 2. I'm going to pick that fly up and cast it back against the bank. Let it sink down deeply and then swim it out in that little darting motion. I'll continue that all the way down as far as you see those arrows going, because when you try to read a river, you don't just look at the water or look at the rocks, you look at what's going on the bank. What you see on the bank is also going to be a continuation of what's going on in that stream bottom. So as I look back through there and look down those arrows, I see all those stones back in there, and I know that's what's going on out in the stream itself. Therefore, I know that is loaded with crayfish. I'm going to use that same technique as far as you see my arrows going, and I'm going to catch a lot of crayfish in against those banks in relatively shallow water. In addition to the crayfish tactics we just talked about in shallow water, it can be very effective, as you see Jeff just setting the hook. See, he's setting with a line hand as well as the rod. He just hooked a very big smallmouth out there at number 1. That water where he just hooked that fish is probably about shoulder deep. Boulders down in there, because of the lay of the land, those are bigger boulders. Bushel basket up to maybe an SUV size out in there. Now, where the crayfish locate around those big boulders are down along the underneath edge. They're right on the bottom, smack dab on the bottom, but they're using that big boulder as the shade, and they're right where the boulder meets the bottom. Jeff drifted that right along and nailed that bass. That turned out to be a very big bass. After he landed that one, he would make his next cast on down toward number 2. Big boulders out in there now. They're down deep. Swim it around the edge of the boulder. The current's pushing now. As Jeff is stripping that around those big boulders you'd find on number 2 and number 3, the current is also pushing that crayfish, his pattern now, the artificial crayfish. The current is pushing that downstream, and he's using care to swim his crayfish with little jumping type motions all along underneath those big boulders. That is a very effective technique, and some of the biggest fish we catch are with this method. The techniques that we have just covered here are very important in our school, because no matter where you're going to be smallmouth fishing, whether it's the Susquehanna, the James, the Shenandoah, these are the backbone of all smallmouth fishing. The streamer fishing that we showed you, that's meat and potatoes. If you couldn't catch a smallmouth any other way than with a fly rod, that's what you're going to go to. But then when you think about how important the crayfish is in their diet of the smallmouth, I just feel that it's important that we teach that in our class because everybody knows about the crayfish. They know them when they see them. And then if we can convincingly teach that in our schools here on the Shenandoah River, that's going to enable that angler to actually get better fishing and understand what he's doing and why. So these things we touch in the school, and it's just not a matter of going out and having a big time. We're actually trying to enable that angler to grow and develop his techniques with these methods.